There we go. And once again, I would like to welcome everyone to the LA Birders webinar for tonight. I encourage you, please, to join LA Birders. Your support helps support things like this webinar, which is very important. They're all recorded, and we have well more than 50 on our website right now, ranging from ID through scientific, through coloration, colors of birds and why to, etc. It's wonderful. We've had some world famous scientists to help explain that to us. So that's very, very important. Also, it helps us develop local field helps in the development of local field ornithology projects, such as our informal LA River Survey and the Bird Atlas that'll be coming up in future years. We hope to be a big part of that. And with that, let's move on to our next slide. And again, Susan, would you please do us the honors? Susan? Susan, you're on mute.
Thank you, Ron. Los Angeles Birders is very happy to have Dr. Neate-Clegg with us tonight. Dr. Neate-Clegg says he's been into birds for as long as he can remember. He grew up in rural Southwest England, chasing birds around the countryside and the coast, and for much of his life, birds were just a hobby. While his interest in ecology and evolution developed in tandem, leading to his bachelor's degree at Oxford University, it wasn't until he was doing his master's degree at Imperial College, London, that he realized he could turn birds into his career. His master's thesis took him to the coastal rainforests of tropical North Queensland, where he investigated how forest edges alter the bird community. Following this, he measured thousands of bird specimens at the Natural History Museum in London in an effort to gather trait data for the world's birds. He then joined Operation Wallaceia's annual expedition in Honduras, where he conducted bird point counts throughout the misty montane cloud forests. These three experiences cemented his passion for tropical ornithology, macroecology, and conservation biology. So in 2016, Monte began his PhD at the University of Utah, where he focused on birds in tropical mountains and how they are responding to climate change. In addition, he researched many subjects spanning global community science data, Utah's riparian birds, birds in Amazonian agriculture, global raptor conservation, and dispersal ability in birds. His fieldwork has taken him to Tanzania, Ethiopia, Turkey, Honduras, and Australia, using point counts and mist netting to survey birds, and in Utah, he managed 2 bird banding field stations. After finishing his PhD, Monte started a postdoc with Dr. Morgan Tingley at UCLA, where he is investigating the effects of climate change on bird distributions and demographic rates over large spatial temporal scales. So please welcome Dr. Monte Neate-Clegg as he discusses responses of migratory birds to climate change in North America.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan, for that very thorough introduction. That's probably one of the best introductions I've had, I think. So hopefully now you guys should be seeing my screen, and I'm just going to bring up my notes. I have those. Where's that?
Yes, it looks great. Thanks, Monty.
Perfect. Right. So everyone should be seeing that. Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. As Susan said, my name is Monty, and I'm a postdoc in the Tingley Lab at UCLA. And while a lot of my PhD was on elevational gradients in the tropics, I'll be bringing things a little bit closer to home in this talk about how migratory birds in North America are responding to climate change. So to give a little bit of signposting for this talk, I'm first of all going to give a general introduction about the importance of bird banding, because the 2 studies I'm going to talk about today have used bird banding for various effects in relation to climate change. And the first of those stories is looking at trends in migratory timing over time across North America. And the second of those stories is about variation in the use of riparian corridors by birds. But before we get into those stories, I'm going to give some general background about bird banding. And my bird banding experience began back in 2016 now. Yesterday was my 6th year, or 6 years of living in the US. And pretty much as soon as I moved to the US, where I did my PhD in Utah, I started to learn the skills of bird banding. And I did it here. This is Red Butte Field Station, which is just behind the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. And it's a really beautiful place. It's lovely riparian habitat, nestled among the canyons of northern Utah. And it was there that I started handling my first birds and getting to grips with some of the riparian species there. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with bird banding and mist netting, but if not, here's just a little animation to kind of illustrate the point. So we set up these static nets, and birds are basically flying around and flying past, and some of those are flying into those nets. And we fix those birds with little aluminum bands that go around their legs. And each one of those bands has a unique number. And then when we go back in the future, sometimes we'll catch birds that we've already caught before, and sometimes we'll catch new birds. And it's with these techniques that we're able to harvest some of the most valuable data in ornithology. And Red Butte was a great place to learn banding because it allowed me to get up and close with birds that I'm used to seeing further afield. You get to appreciate some of the details in species that you normally take for granted, like mourning dove. I think not many of us notice the pink on a mourning dove's neck when we're normally seeing it in the field. And sometimes those birds are also getting to grips with you, like this northern flicker. And bird banding is also a really important tool for outreach, and it allows us to interact with the public, such as the university classes or summer camps. And I've also been up and seen the people banding up at Bear Divide. And I hope if you haven't seen them doing that, you should definitely go up and have a look. It's a great way to engage with the public and educate about the importance of bird banding. And the other station that I was lucky enough to run in Utah is called Rio Mesa. It's in southern Utah in the Colorado Plateau. So we're talking red rock, desert, slightly different bird communities, maybe bird communities a bit more familiar to you guys in Southern California. And it was between these two stations that I started getting interested in riparian birds and what we can use these data sets for in conservation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of bird banding, first of all. And one of the benefits is better identification. And I tried to find this photo earlier, but a few years ago, one of the banders sent me a photo and he said, "I've got this really weird thrush. Can you tell me what it was?" And I looked at the photo and I realized straight away that it wasn't a thrush. It was actually an oven bird. I realized the bird here is actually a hermit thrush. But they'd actually found an oven bird and they didn't even realize, but because they had it in the hand, because they were able to take photos of it, we were able to actually find one of Utah's first oven bird records, which is pretty unusual. Another advantage is being able to sex birds. And yes, in downy woodpeckers, it's pretty easy to sex birds in the field, but sometimes it's only having them in the hand that allows you to do that, because you can look for things like cloacal protuberance and be able to sex birds that are actually difficult to distinguish in the field. And on a similar note, you could also age birds. So you might see a nice blue lazuli bunting in the field, but only by looking at the feathers in the hand can you realize that it's actually a second-year bird as opposed to an after second-year bird. Another very advantageous thing is morphometrics. And I'm not going to talk too much about morphometrics in this presentation today, but I have contributed morphometric data to what is now a globally published data set called AVANET. And I have colleagues who are using morphometrics from across North America to look at how climate change is affecting morphology. And also, this is the only bird, I think, in this talk that was not taken in North America. This is a green bull from Tanzania. Another beneficial thing we can look at is body condition. And we look at things like fat scores in order to work out how healthy a bird is. We also weigh them in these little pots as shown here. And so then we can start looking at how environmental things such as smoke might be affecting body condition. And the last one, and perhaps the most important one to me, is capture histories. And what a capture history is the history of the individuals that you have captured. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that later, but basically being able to plot the lifespans of individual birds is one of the great advantages of bird banding. So after that sort of brief introduction to the benefits of banding, I'm going to tell two different stories. And the first story is about trends in migratory timing across North America. And the second story is about variation in the use of riparian corridors, specifically in the Western US. So this first story revolves around this question: are birds of certain ages or sexes shifting their migratory phenology faster than others? So you'll probably be aware of this general idea that over time we are starting to see birds arriving earlier and earlier every spring. So this is a plot from Europe, and you have years on the x-axis and arrival day on the y-axis. And this line is going down to the right, which means arrival days are getting earlier and earlier over time. And just to introduce a diagram that I'm going to use throughout this part of the talk, what we're seeing is over time, birds arriving earlier and earlier. Why are they doing this? Well, what we pretty much know is happening is because temperatures are increasing over time, species are arriving earlier and earlier in order to match a certain temperature within which they want to breed. And why does that matter? Well, temperature is linked to greenup. So the timing of leaves coming out on the trees is linked to temperature. And birds want to be arriving at the time when those leaves are coming out, because that's when the caterpillars are going to be there. That's the food that they're going to feed their young. So they are interested in timing their breeding to match the leaves coming out on the trees. And so with earlier and earlier green up in spring, birds want to be arriving earlier and earlier over time. Some other things that we also know about migratory birds is that we know that males tend to arrive before females. And this is known as protandry, and it's been documented for several decades now. And there are some good reasons to think why this may happen, and mainly that males want to get here first in order to set up their territories. And then when the females arrive, they're already primed and ready to go. Another thing we know about migration is that adults tend to arrive before immatures. And again, we have pretty good reasons to believe, to understand why this is. And that's usually because adults are both more experienced on migration, but they probably also got more resources on their wintering grounds, say in the Caribbean. And so they were able to get enough resources faster than the immatures, leave earlier than them, and get back to the breeding grounds faster than the immatures. So these are some things we know about migration. One thing we know less about is trends in migration between different groups, i.e. are arrival times changing differently between different groups of birds or within a species. So there's one study of black-throated blue warblers in North America, and they found that males and females both are arriving earlier and earlier over time, but they didn't really find a difference between the two. And there's also been a study from Europe of 8 different species. And again, there's not been any statistically significant differences in phenology trends between males and females. And so far, I've pretty much only talked about spring. We know even less about fall migration. We know very little about what trends should be doing. In general, studies aren't really finding many strong responses. So you could apply all of these questions to fall migration and ask what on earth is going there. So the questions for the study are: across migratory birds of North America, does spring migration phenology differ between males and females, or between adults and immatures? Do trends in migratory phenology differ between males and females and adults and immatures? And what is happening during fall? So to get at this question, I made use of the Bird Banding Lab's colossal bird banding data set. So if you are aware of maps, or if you're aware of anyone using bird banding data, the chances are they're having to get their bands from USGS, and when they do that, they have to submit their data back to USGS. So USGS and the Bird Banding Lab have this huge repository of bird banding data spanning the continent, spanning 60 years, and it's a really, really fantastic data set to dig into. And I took this whole data set, which is, I think, 25 million records, something like that. I applied a series of filters, e.g. filtering down to neotropical migrants that are based in the US or Canada, that are caught during spring or fall migration, and from migration banding stations with at least a decade of data. And this comes down to about 4 million records across 60 years. So within these data, I then wanted to age species. So for spring, I'm categorizing species as either adult or immature, which is after second year or second year, if you're familiar with the pile terminology. Then in fall, we're categorizing them as either adult or juvenile, so after hatch year or hatch year. And then for sex, there are dichromatic species like this phenology warbler, where we are categorizing them as either male, female, or unknown. And unknowns tend to be these either these birds that you can't really tell whether it's a young male or an adult female. And then for monochromatic species, we're categorizing them all as unknown. And I said earlier that you can sex these monochromatic species, so you can have a song sparrow and know if it's a male or a female based on some breeding characteristics. But we wanted to ignore those because those breeding characteristics might have their own phenology. So we're just sexing birds in this study based on plumage. Then we have to estimate phenology, or the spring and fall migratory timing. And so to do this, we took all that data across North America and we aggregate it into these little hexagonal cells. So this is an example of the sort of spatial scale of those cells. So if you imagine those cells are all over the country and banding data are being aggregated into those cells. And then we calculate these Weibull corrective phenometrics. I don't want you to worry about what a Weibull corrective phenometric is. Suffice to say that it's a way of correcting for bias in the data. And importantly, in spring, we're interested in capturing or calculating the first quartile. So that is the onset of spring migration. And we're going to represent spring with these green shoots. And then in the fall, we're interested in the offset of migration. So the third quartile in departure date in the fall. And I'm going to represent fall with this pumpkin. And then we calculate those metrics for every single combination of species, cell, year, age, and sex. And then we throw all this data into a big, scary Bayesian hierarchical model, which I'm not going to go into in any detail at all. And we have separate models for spring and fall. But what's important to know here is that we're modeling these phenometrics as a function of year, age, and sex. So we're looking at whether our demographic groups differ between them and whether they have different trends over time. And we control for the fact that different species are going to have different arrival and departure dates, and the same for cells. And when I go into the results, I'm going to kind of talk about all the spring results first, so with the green shoots, and then I'm going to talk about all the fall results second. So first of all, let's look at overall spring phenology and the results that we have here. So we've got all the different groups along the x-axis. So immature versus adult for females, unknown, and males. And then if a point is lower down, that means it's arriving earlier. And if it's higher up, it's arriving later. It should say arrival day, not departure day. And here are the results for spring. So each of these points is a different species. And they're color-coded according to their arrival time. And what I want you to draw your attention to is the fact that males are arriving before females. So their points are lower down on this graph, which means males are arriving first. So that's confirming the protandry that we have reason to believe would exist in the first place. And the other thing is that adults are arriving before immatures. So again, we're confirming things that have already been found, but we're doing it on a scale that hasn't been done before. So now we get to the more interesting part, which is the trends, because these haven't been tested before between these different groups. And what we find, first of all, is that all demographic groups are advancing spring arrival. So every single group is arriving earlier and earlier over time. But most interestingly, adult males are advancing their phenology faster than females or immatures. So the rate at which adult males are arriving earlier is higher than other groups. Then we can split this up into different species and see if different species are behaving differently. The important takeaways here is there's a different species along the y-axis there. And the main thing we found is that many species are significantly advancing their spring arrival So it seems to be a trend pretty much across the board. And there's a lot of taxonomic diversity here. So we've got everything from yellow-breasted cuckoos at the top all the way down to indigo buntings at the bottom. And most of these species tend to be advancing their phenology. And the only exception seems to be gray-cheeked thrush that's just behaving a little bit oddly and is actually delaying its spring arrival. So what are the implications of these findings? Well, if males arrive before females and advance faster than females, then what we're seeing is an increased degree of protandry over time, an increased gap between male and female arrival over time. And this is the first time this has been demonstrated at this kind of scale. So it's a very cool finding. Now we can turn to fall phenology, and we're going to kind of show things in a similar order. I'll ignore some Spanish there, that's from a previous talk. So what was kind of interesting about fall phenology is, first of all, there was no difference between the sexes. And again, that kind of confirms some previous research that sometimes studies find that males leave first, sometimes studies find females leave first, but across species, there doesn't seem to be any difference. But we did find that on average, adults tend to leave before juveniles. So because there was a lot of variation there, we kind of wanted to dig into that a little bit more and see what could be causing interspecific variation. And one of the ideas we had was maybe it's to do with your molt strategy. So I emailed Peter Pyle and asked him to help me come up with a list categorizing all these species by their molt strategy. And we categorized species into 3 different categories: those that molt on their breeding grounds, like a warbler; those that molt during migration or split their molt either side of migration, like a black-headed grosbeak; and those that do all of their molting on the wintering grounds, like a hummingbird. And what we found is that they have they're very different between the adults leaving and the juveniles leaving. So for species that molt during migration or on wintering grounds, like a hummingbird, adults are more likely to leave before juveniles. So these negative values mean adults are leaving first. And so if they're molting on the wintering grounds, they're more likely to leave before the juveniles. In contrast, for species that molt on the breeding grounds, like a warbler, juveniles are more likely to leave before the adults. So we're seeing a difference between adult and juvenile departure based on their molting strategy. So to put this into kind of pictographic form, what we're finding is for species that molt first, for species that molt on the breeding grounds, the immatures are able to leave first, and then the adults follow on afterwards. Whereas for species that molt on the wintering grounds or on migration, they're able to get ahead of the juveniles, while the juveniles are kind of just getting up to migrating, and then the juveniles follow on behind. So the molting strategy matters for when adults versus juveniles are leaving in the fall. Oh, little molt there. So now let's look at some phenological trends. And what we found was no overall trend in fall departure over time. And this kind of confirms previous studies that weren't really finding any strong trends either. But we did find that males maybe delayed departure a little bit over time, but it wasn't really that significant and it wasn't very important effect. So again, we wanted to dive into some of these interspecific variation. And here we're finding a lot more variation. So there's high interspecific variation in fall trends and stronger trends for juveniles. So overall, we're not finding a strong signal, but that's because some species are strongly advancing their phenology and some species are strongly delaying that phenology, and that kind of cancels out overall, but there's this high interspecific variation. And again, we tried to explain some of that interspecific variation. And one of the things we found was that in species where adults leave before juveniles, like hummingbirds, adults are more likely than juveniles to advance their phenology. So if you're leaving first, your phenology is more flexible. And kind of the opposite pattern, in species where adults leave after juveniles, adults are less likely than juveniles to advance their phenology. So basically the age group that leaves first is more flexible than the age group that leaves second. What are the implications of this? Well, if juveniles are going first, we're seeing an increased gap in departure dates. Whereas if adults are leaving first, we're also seeing an increased gap. So regardless of who goes first, we're seeing an increased gap between those 2 different groups in their departure dates. So that kind of ends the fall part of this, and I want to talk a little bit about mismatching. So mismatching, well, first of all, what is matching? A species wants to match the resources in spring, and I'm going to talk about spring, but this could also apply for fall. Species want to arrive and match the resources so that they can feed their babies with the resources that are around. And so mismatch results when trends in the phenology of the resources are different from the trends in the adults. So if bud burst or caterpillar arrival is advancing faster over time than the adult migratory phenology, then you get this increased gap, which we call mismatch. And that could mean that when the birds are breeding, there are not enough resources around because that peak in resources has already passed. What we might be finding in this study is mismatches between the sexes. So if males are advancing faster than females, there might actually be a mismatch between males and females. And we don't really know what this could mean ecologically. Perhaps it means that males are defending their territory for longer than they need to. Perhaps it means we're underestimating mismatch for females. But it seems very important that because they're having different trends between males and females, there could be some important ecological considerations that people haven't really thought about before. So to conclude this part of the talk, in spring, we found that adult males arrive before other groups, and they advance faster than other groups. And this is causing the degree of protandry to increase. So they're increasing that degree of the gap between male and female arrival. In the fall, there was no overall trend over time, but adults tend to leave before juveniles, and this seems to be linked in part to molting strategy, but there are probably other strategies at play. So that concludes the first half of this talk. And in the second half, I'm now going to switch gears a little bit. So I've taken this very like North America scale approach in the first half, and now we're going to go a bit more local. And we're going to look at the effects of climate variation on riparian birds in the arid West. So let's take a map of the US. And in the previous part of this talk, I was talking about trends in phenology across this whole landscape. But when we look at this aerial photography, we can clearly see that the landscape across the United States is very varied. And you would think that species or populations in different parts of the country would be responding in different ways. And a lot of research is biased towards the eastern half of the US, and that's partly because there's more data over there. And migrating over the East Coast is very different from migrating over the West Coast. So if you imagine you're a bird flying over Virginia and you want to make a pit stop in order to get some resources, refuel during your migration. Well, if you're flying over this landscape, I think you can appreciate that it is a very green landscape, and there are lots of options in terms of stopping and getting food. So the landscape is basically homogeneous, lots of options. You don't need to worry too much about where you're going to refuel. Now let's show a similar image, but this time for southern Utah. So this is actually very close to one of the research stations I was managing, which is here, this Rio Mesa. And this landscape clearly is very, very different. This is the Colorado Plateau. It's all red rock, it's all desert. And then going through the center of this slide is the Colorado River, which is this little strip of green in a sea of orange. So here, resources are clearly not widely distributed. Your options for refueling are very limited. And so you have to make certain choices about where you're going to be during migration. And normally I give this is a talk about Utah, and there will be a talk about Utah, but the same principles apply to Southern California as well. So this is a wash in the Mojave Desert near Victorville. Again, it's a ribbon of green in a sort of desert landscape. But it's not just deserts where this matters. So this is Temescal Canyon in Malibu. And again, riparian areas are much greener than the surrounding landscape. So even in this chaparral habitat and in montane habitat, riparian areas tend to have more resources and more plants than the surrounding habitat. And there are other kinds of desert as well, including the kind of urban desert. And so places like Sepulveda Basin and Haskell Creek are also very important for migratory birds, providing resources in what is quite a challenging landscape. So the ideas of this part of the talk will kind of apply not only to Utah, where the study took place, but also to Southern California. And it's worth bearing in mind that some of the species using these resources on migration are not necessarily desert species. They might be species migrating all the way up to the Pacific Northwest, but they have to get through this desert in order to get there. And outside of North America, there are also deserts like this in the Middle East and Central Asia. So this is probably a problem for species throughout the world that are migrating over very dry places to get where they want to be. So in this part of the talk, I'll be asking, how does climate variation affect birds in riparian zones? And I'm going to take sort of two levels in this talk. The first part is going to be community level responses, and the second part is going to be population level responses. So to get at this question, this was a collaboration with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, mostly while I was still doing my PhD. And we took data from 8 map stations across the state of Utah. And these are those 8 stations. They fall kind of neatly into 2 categories. We have the northern mountains, so around Salt Lake City, where it's a little bit more green, but the riparian areas are still a lot more green than the surrounding kind of shrubby scrub oak habitat. And then we have the 4 stations in the southern deserts, mainly on the Colorado Plateau, where, as I was kind of talking about earlier, we have these ribbons of green in a landscape of orange. Now, to look at the effects of environmental variation, I needed environmental data. So I extracted temperature and precipitation data for each station from PRISM. I also looked at El Nino Southern Oscillation Index, which is a measure of climatic variability at kind of transcontinental scales. And I also looked at landscape greenness, which is a kind of more direct measure of the resources available in these landscapes. And I also controlled for the effects of year, region, and station. So here's some diagrams of what those environmental variables were doing over the study period. And they bump around a little bit. The take-home message is there weren't really any strong trends over time, except a slight decrease in precipitation over time. But mainly we're interested in the interannual variation in these variables. So let's first take a look at the community level responses. And I was interested in 2 metrics here, the total captures on each banding day and also the species richness on each banding day. And I modeled these as a function of those 4 environmental covariates. But an important thing here is that we know that there are big spatial scales or spatial gradients in these covariates, with the north being hotter and cooler and greener than the south. And we want to get rid of those spatial gradients and only be interested in temporal gradients. So what we did is we took the data on the left and then we scaled it at the station level. So we get the data on the right. And what that data is interannual variation in those variables rather than spatial gradients in those variables. So we're interested in hotter versus cooler years, wetter versus dry years, and greener versus less green years. So before I show some results, I'm going to kind of give you a sense of what to expect. So these are going to be some coefficient plots. So these are the effects of those covariates on our response variables, so species richness and abundance. And each point represents a coefficient, and it has these 95% confidence intervals. And if those confidence intervals overlap 0, that means it's not statistically significant. If it's above the line, that means it's a positive association. And if it's below the line, that means it's a negative association. So I'm going to run through these one at a time. And basically, I'll just kind of cut to the chase. What we found was that there was a positive effect of temperature on total captures and species richness. There was a negative effect of precipitation. There was a positive effect of El Nino. And there was a negative effect of greenness. So I'm going to kind of walk through this in a variety of ways to kind of help convey this message. So what we're finding here is that captures and species richness increase in hotter, drier, less green, and El Nino years. So I wanted to break this down into different groups and see if they were responding differently. And so I split all the species in these data sets into 2 groups. The first group is riparian species, and these are species that breed in riparian areas of Utah, such as the yellow warbler and the lazuli bunting. And then we have non-riparian species, and these either do not breed in Utah, like Cassin's vireo, or they do not breed in riparian areas within Utah, such as juniper titmouse. So what do we find when we analyze these 2 different groups separately? Well, when we looked at riparian species, what we found is that those coefficients were actually smaller and often not significant So the effects were reduced for riparian species, meaning that riparian species were less sensitive to climate variation overall. However, when we look at the non-riparian species, we found larger coefficients. And what that means is the effects were increased for non-riparian species, meaning that non-riparian species were more sensitive to climate variation than riparian species. And this was particularly true for precipitation. So they're way more sensitive to variation in precipitation than riparian species. So what does this mean in like a real world situation? So what we're finding is that in hotter, drier, and less green years, we're catching more birds of more different species in riparian zones. So hotter years, drier years, more diversity in riparian areas. And this is especially true of non-riparian species. So now let's go to the population level responses. And this brings me back to what I was talking about in the introduction, which is the importance of capture histories and the importance of those luminant bands that go on each individual bird. So each bird gets a unique number, and that allows you to track that individual bird throughout its life if you recapture it. And we build up these capture histories for individual birds. So basically, let's say we capture a bird in year 1, and then we don't capture it in year 2 or year 3. We recapture it in year 4, and then again in year 6. And so that's the capture history of this individual bird. And we turn that into a series of 1s and 0s. And then when you do that for every single individual that you have caught, you have a capture history on every single row there. And we're able to leverage these captures and recaptures to understand demographic parameters, because we know that this bird was alive in year 6. And therefore, in year 5, it clearly wasn't dead and resurrected. It was there, we just didn't capture it. And so we can control for the fact that we have this imperfect capture probability when estimating demographic parameters. And we can also work out things like how long they live for, how many new birds are joining the population every year, and so on. So with these capture histories, we do what's called these mark recapture models. And there are 3 parameters that I was interested in. So we have survival or apparent survival, which is the rate at which birds don't die and don't leave the population by emigration. We have recruitment, which is the rate at which new birds join the population either through birth or by immigration. And we have population growth rates, which is the sum of the other 2 parameters. And we model each of these 3 parameters as a function of those same 4 climate covariates as before. And we were able to do this for 30 riparian breeding species. And it's going to be similar kind of coefficients as before, with dots above the line meaning positive association and dots below the line meaning negative association, except now every single dot is representing a different species. So we have the 4 different environmental covariates along the x-axis there, and remember that every dot is a different species. So what we found across these 30 species is a negative association with temperature and a negative association with El Nino. Now, for population growth rates to change, there must either be a change in apparent survival or a change in recruitment rates, or both. So which of those was changing to cause this response? Well, when we looked at apparent survival rates, we didn't really find very many strong trends at all. So it doesn't seem to be apparent survival rates that are sensitive to these climatic variations. However, when we looked at recruitment rates, so the joining of new individuals to the population, we find a similar results. So a negative effect of temperature and a negative effect of El Nino. So these population results, therefore, are that population growth rates decreased in hotter and El Nino years, and this was driven by changes in recruitment. Now, we found some sensitivity to temperature there, but it's also worth bearing in mind that all these climate variables are kind of connected. And so one thing we can show is that hotter years are also drier years. So it also matters that precipitation also matters in these systems, i.e. in droughts, we're finding lower population growth rates. So I don't know if you were following this that closely, but this might seem like some contradictory results between the community level results and the population level results. So at the community level, we have arrows going in these directions, and the population results, we have arrows going in the opposite directions. So how do we reconcile the fact that we were getting opposing trends at these 2 different levels of organization? Well, The way we interpret what's going on is as follows. In a wet year or a normal year, birds are more or less spread out across the landscape. They're making use of ephemeral resources such as smaller streams and washes. But then when you get hotter years, those ephemeral resources dry out, the resources are reduced, and it causes birds to then be pushed or funneled into more permanent sources of vegetation, more permanent sources of water, and that leads to an increase in both the captures and the species richness in those perennial riparian areas where all of the banding stations are located. But the downside of this is that because resources are generally lower and there's more birds competing for them in these riparian areas, the increased competition is probably lowering the demographic rates of the species that actually breed in riparian zones. So that's why we're getting these contrasting results. We're getting more species in general, but lower demographic rates of the species that actually breed in riparian areas. So to conclude this part of the talk, in hotter years, in dry years, and in less green years, and El Nino years, we're finding that captures and species richness increased along perennial streams, but the population growth rates decreased via low recruitment. Now, this is a kind of somewhat preliminary study, and we're not exactly sure on the mechanisms involved. So there are a lot of future questions that kind of come out of this. So is this occurring elsewhere in the US or indeed the world, such as in Southern California? Are birds declining outside of riparian areas at the same time that they're increasing in riparian areas? Which climate windows are more relevant? Because we used variables across the whole year. Is it spring temperature that matters? Is it winter precipitation that matters? Things like snow melt. And what actual mechanisms are driving changes in recruitment? And one potential way to maybe address this is to not use banding data, but use a resource like eBird. So one possibility might be to take hotspots that are in riparian areas and compare them to hotspots that are in non-riparian areas and see whether you get opposing trends during hotter years. So in hotter, dry years, the species richness increase in riparian areas and decrease in non-riparian areas. And basically, we would need for that data from hotspots and cold spots. So this is the point where I encourage everyone to not only bird in those tasty hotspots along riparian corridors, but also to bird in the non-riparian areas, especially during hot and dry times, to see whether birds are actually using those landscapes or not. So now I can get to some take-home messages from all parts of this talk. First of all, I hope I've demonstrated that bird banding is super important for monitoring birds, and we can use these data in a variety of ways to answer a lot of different questions. In particular, I've used these data to show that climate change can have diverse impacts on migratory birds, and that includes species advancing their spring phenology, some more than others, with males advancing particularly faster than females and immatures. And I've also shown that riparian areas are critical for migrants in the arid West, especially during those drier and hotter years. And I kind of want to also add, what can we all do to help contribute to these questions? And I think there are options to volunteer at bird banding stations like Bear Divide. Of course, contribute to eBird. I'm sure most of you are already, but the more data we get, the better. And the kinds of data we record are also important, as I'm sure has been stressed in many different webinars here. But recording age and sex where possible will be great for future data usages, because I feel like that's not really done enough. Go birding in both riparian areas and non-riparian habitats to see how species are using both habitats during hotter and colder years. And a big one for LA in particular is helping to restore riparian habitat. And as a birder, I've definitely been saddened to be birding along the LA River and seeing habitat being bulldozed actively in front of my eyes. And I really did not appreciate that. So the more that we can do to restore riparian habitats and provide critical resources and refuges for birds during migration, the better those migratory birds are going to be in those stressful years. So with that, I would like to say thank you all for listening. I want to say thank you to my current advisor, Morgan Tingley, and my previous advisor, Chan Shakerjulu. as well as all of the universities and collaborations and funding and so on. And yes, once again, thank you all for listening. I'll take questions.
And we want to thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation. If you have any questions, and I'm sure you do, please put them in the Q&A. The Q&A helps us keep track of all the questions that come through. We'd appreciate that.
Yes, and thank you very much, Monty. And we have a question from Alex. Alex asks, if the trend continues where males are arriving before females, is it projected they may actually miss a breeding opportunity?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I don't know whether they'll miss it, but they might not be in a great state when it rolls around. So if you imagine that over evolutionary time, they're arriving at some time which is optimized to set up territory and wait for females. Well, if they're arriving, a week earlier than they needed to, they may be exhausted by the time that females arrive, and maybe, I don't know, this is all kind of hand-wavy speculation, but they might not be in good enough condition when those females do arrive in order to, take full advantage of that situation.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Let's see. We have another question from another one of the Lab S students, Calvin. Since not all banded birds are recaptured, did a smaller sample size affect your results when examining the data at the population level?
Yeah, for sure. So it's very important to have high recapture rates in these kinds of models. And that's why we're only really able to analyze microcapture models for about 30 species out of the 150 or so that are caught. So you do have to have a minimum level of captures total and also a minimum level of recaptures. But if some species are recaptured less than others, that will be reflected in their recapture probabilities, which is one of the parameters that I don't talk about, but it's kind of that nuisance parameter that you have to control for when looking at the parameters you're interested in.
Great, thank you. Lance asks, how are MODIS records affecting this research? It would seem to have considerable potential to detect birds not caught at banding stations regularly and or remove some of the banding biases.
Yes, we're all very excited to see what happens with that. If you're able to actually actively track birds on migration, that's wonderful. And there's I want to give a big shout out in general to tracking studies, because tracking studies are giving you every point during migration rather than these snapshots, which banding data are. They're just like, you caught a bird once during migration. Tracking can tell you so much, such as migration speed and what time they left the wintering ground, what time they arrived in spring, how they use stopover sites. So as that kind of technology increases, including MODIS, including the decreasing size of GPS trackers, pretty soon we'll be able to put GPS trackers on smaller and smaller songbirds, and that's going to give us open up a whole new revolution of understanding migratory birds.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're all very excited to see that happen.
Yeah.
Yes. And something else come up in the chat. And we're getting lots of wonderful comments on people thanking you for a wonderful presentation.
And promising to redouble their e-birding input.
Yes,
even better.
Yes, you definitely helped a lot of us become more and more enthusiastic about negative data, about going out to place. Yeah.
It can be hard to motivate yourself when you have the choice of a nice green hotspot and then some brown wasteland, but yeah.
Yeah, and understanding the importance of not finding something it really helps in your motivation.
Exactly, yeah.
Absolutely.
For your research, what specific data would be helpful in individual eBird checklists? You said age and sex. Are there other things that we should be doing as well?
Yeah, there are all kinds of things. So first of all, I work with eBird an increasing amount now during my postdoc, and the first thing we do when we're filtering eBird is remove incomplete checklists. So that's probably been said by other speakers, I'm sure, but complete checklists are very important to begin with, because it then assumes that the effort is kind of controlled for. Other things that we think we're going to be able to use in the future are some of these other breeding codes. So, putting in your breeding codes where possible will be very helpful. And I have colleagues that are starting to use those breeding codes across North America to see phenology trends in those, which is really exciting. In general, the more data, the better. So just trying to like tick every box, basically.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're running out of questions. Monty, again, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. We've had lots and lots of comments about what a wonderful presentation it was.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you very much.
Yep, thank
Very
you so much.
excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Sweet. Thank you.
Learned
And
a lot too.
And please, to you, Monty, and to everyone else, please join us next week. David Bell will cover the 4 cormorants that we generally have here in Southern California, tell you things that you may not know about cormorant ID, and help us when we're submitting our eBird checklist. And I'm just double checking the chat. And again, thank you very much. We're getting lots and lots of great comments. Thank you very, very much. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone a good evening, and we'll see you next week or in the field. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Monty.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks
Monty.
again.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.